Something is happening that the technology industry's most powerful company did not model for, did not prepare for, did not believe was possible at the scale it is now occurring. Ordinary people, not developers, not system administrators, not open-source enthusiasts with a philosophical grudge against proprietary software, are leaving Windows in numbers that are no longer rounding errors, and the operating system pulling them away is not the one anyone predicted. It is not Ubuntu, it is not Fedora, it is not Arch, the distribution that became a personality trait for the people who use it. It is Linux Mint, a distribution so deliberately, almost aggressively ordinary that its entire design philosophy can be summarized in 4 words. It just works. And that simplicity, that radical, almost boring commitment to being immediately usable by anyone who has ever touched a Windows machine is causing a migration that Microsoft's retention teams did not see coming and do not currently have an answer for. Here is why Linux Mint specifically, and not the dozens of other Linux distributions that have been trying to pull Windows users for 2 decades. Linux Mint does not ask you to learn Linux. It asks you to use a computer. The interface is familiar. The taskbar is at the bottom. The Start menu opens in the bottom left corner. The file manager works like Windows Explorer. The system settings look like Control Panel. Every visual and structural decision has been made to minimize the cognitive distance between what a Windows user already knows and what Linux Mint requires them to learn. That distance used to be the wall. For 20 years, Linux advocates made the mistake of presenting Linux as a superior alternative that required investment to unlock. You had to learn the terminal. You had to understand package managers. You had to be willing to spend a weekend troubleshooting drivers. The reward was there for those who made the investment, but the investment itself kept the mainstream user population on Windows regardless of how frustrated they were with Microsoft. Linux Mint removed the investment requirement, and the timing could not have been more catastrophic for Windows 10 reached end of life in October 2025. Hundreds of millions of machines, functional, capable, completely adequate for everything their owners used them for, were told they were no longer supported. The choice Microsoft presented was stark: upgrade to Windows 11, which many of those machines could not run due to hardware requirements, or pay $30 per device per year for extended security updates on an operating system. Microsoft had already decided to abandon. For the first time in the history of consumer computing, a massive population of Windows users found themselves actively searching for alternatives at exactly the moment the best alternative for non-technical users had become genuinely ready for them. The search volume for Linux Mint spiked to levels that distribution maintainers described as unprecedented. Reddit communities dedicated to Linux Mint migration reported hundreds of thousands of new members in a matter of weeks. The forums were not filled with developers asking technical questions. They were filled with retired teachers, small business owners, and grandparents asking how to move their photos and whether their printer would work. That demographic shift is the signal that Microsoft should be most alarmed by. Developers leaving Windows for Linux is not new. Developers have been doing that for years, and the Microsoft enterprise business absorbed it without visible damage. But when the non-technical mainstream user, the person who has never once considered an alternative to Windows because alternatives seem too complicated, starts actively migrating, the foundation of Microsoft's consumer market is being pulled from underneath them. Linux Mint's numbers make this impossible to dismiss as anecdote. As of 2025, Linux Mint is consistently ranked as the most popular Linux distribution for desktop users on multiple tracking platforms. Its installer has been downloaded tens of millions of times. The Cinnamon desktop environment. Mint's flagship interface has become the reference point for how a Linux desktop should look and feel for users coming from Windows. Distributions that want to attract mainstream users study what Mint does and copy it. Mint set the standard that the entire Linux desktop ecosystem is now competing to match. The hardware compatibility situation that used to doom Linux migrations for mainstream users has been quietly and comprehensively resolved. Linux Mint 22 ships with driver detection that automatically identifies and installs the correct drivers for the vast majority of hardware configurations on first boot. Wi-Fi adapters that required manual driver installation 3 years ago work out of the box. Printer support through CEPS has expanded to cover the majority of consumer printer models. GPU drivers for both AMD and NVIDIA are manageable through a graphical driver manager that requires no terminal interaction. The user who installs Linux Mint today does not need to know what a terminal is to have a fully functional system within 30 minutes of starting the installation. That was not true in 2020. It is true now. And the timing of that technical maturity arriving at exactly the moment Microsoft pushed hundreds of millions of users into the search for alternatives is not something Microsoft's product roadmap accounted for. The software situation, historically the strongest argument for staying on Windows, has been transformed by browser-based applications and cross-platform development. Microsoft Office, the application suite that kept more users on Windows than any other single piece of software, now runs in a browser. Google Workspace runs in a browser. Every major productivity application has either developed a native Linux version, developed a web application that runs identically across all platforms, or has a Linux native alternative that handles the same workflows without meaningful quality loss. LibreOffice, which ships pre-installed on Linux Mint, handles Microsoft Office file formats with a compatibility rate that covers the overwhelming majority of everyday document, spreadsheet, and presentation needs. For users who are not financial analysts building complex Excel models or graphic designers working with advanced word formatting, LibreOffice is not a compromise. It is a complete replacement. Steam's Proton compatibility layer has made the gaming argument against Linux migration significantly weaker than it was. Over 19,000 titles in the Steam library are verified or playable on Linux. Linux Mint users can install Steam, enable Proton, and access the majority of their existing game library without purchasing anything new or learning anything technical. The games run, that is the entirety of what most gamers need from their operating system. Here is what Microsoft's response to the Linux Mint exodus has looked like in practice. They have made Windows 11 more aggressive. More AI features, more Copilot integration, more start menu advertisements, more telemetry, more subscription nudges, more forced updates. Every response to user frustration has been to add more of the things that caused the frustration. The product has become more extractive at exactly the moment when a clean, fast, free, advertisement-free alternative became genuinely accessible to mainstream users. That is not a retention strategy, that is acceleration of departure. The users who have already made the switch are not going back. The Linux Mint Reddit community and forums are filled with posts from people who made the switch expecting to return to Windows within a week, and are writing 6 months later to say they never did. The pattern is consistent across age groups, technical skill levels, and use cases. The initial friction is lower than expected. The ongoing experience is cleaner than Windows had been for years. The cost is zero. Microsoft built an empire on the assumption that switching away from Windows was too hard for ordinary people to seriously consider. Linux Mint just proved that assumption wrong. Not for developers. Not for technical enthusiasts. For retired teachers. For small business owners. For grandparents who just want to check their email and look at their photos without being shown Copilot advertisements. The exodus is not coming. It is happening. The searches are happening. The downloads are happening. The forum posts from first-time Linux users are happening. And the number of people writing those posts is growing every week. Microsoft still has dominant market share. The institutional inertia of 30 years does not evaporate overnight. But the mainstream user who has never considered an alternative is now considering one. And the alternative they are considering is so deliberately, carefully designed to be familiar that the consideration is increasingly ending in installation. Bill Gates built Microsoft's empire on making computing accessible to ordinary people. Linux Mint just used that exact same principle to start dismantling it. Drop your Mint experience below.